Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where I talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the series premiere of Next. A great series premiere. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Obviously, at the beginning, we kind of get 6 months in the past where we have Paul, talking about and I thought it was such an interesting comparison to make. It's obviously about all the nerds who were behind making the atom bomb, about the repercussions of the aftermath of potentially using that. And it's just not everyone in that bunker agreed on it, but it's still none of them were 100% sure what was going to happen. Yes, this wasn't the worst case scenario when things, because it was it was going to mess up stuff in burn the atmosphere, and it's it could have been basically they didn't know whether or not they were going to blow up the world. But it's he's I'm a tech billionaire and stuff like that. So some of you might be asking, why am I sounding the alarms now? Well, just because of everything that's going on, he just feels it's only in the next couple of years, because even at the beginning of the episode, it quotes Elon Musk, which I think is so interesting to think about that, because usually when things get quoted, it's usually I don't know, I feel like it's more so very, very long since dead people. So it's kind of weird to have someone very modern day, doing you get what I mean? It seems so interesting. But regardless, it's just obviously all these other smart people are warning about it as well, So obviously we cut to 6 months later, which is present day. The whole thing with Dr. Weiss, affected him he's even a doctor because I'm calling on. But Mr. Weiss, it's his whole situation is he's trying to get a map, and obviously he's trying to stay off anything with the connection, because he's there in the convenience store, and it's the dude at the cashier's oh, that's been on the fritz all week, and he's crap. So his phone lights up, and it's he knows he's in trouble. Then this other couple is used as a murder weapon. And I said this during my during this month's watch list, looking at the trailer for this, I was this kind of reminds me of the movie Eagle Eye. The whole premise behind this just definitely reminds me a lot of Eagle Eye. But obviously Weiss is someone that's important to Salazar. We haven't gotten into it, but they do hint to it later on, because we find out why he's so important to her. Because his actual daughter is he always was so proud of you, and he thinks of you kind of like me. He looks at you like he looks at me, like a daughter. And it's we find out it's oh, he's just the guy that saved her life under what? Because at one point she's looking at the mirror, and there's these marks on her if you're smarter than people who are smarter than me know probably exactly what those markings represent. I'm not 100% sure, but obviously I'm assuming it has something to do with how Weiss saved her life. So obviously for her, she wanted to figure this situation out, because obviously everything is pointing towards it just being an accident. But obviously one of the people he was trying to get, the person he was trying to get to at that time was Paul, and we kind of learned more about Paul. And I think it's that whole thing about being, smart. I think that's typically the thing of when you're kind of a super genius, you don't have the most social skills. And obviously Paul's having that whole conversation with his daughter. Even when he's having those conversations with his daughter, he's kind of coming off like an asshole. But the fact of the matter is, his daughter's why are you reaching out now? She's basically taking it as, you got kicked out, you left your company. He's I didn't leave, I got fired. But it's she's you're just trying to fill that void. And then at one point he gets a fork and puts in a plastic. I'm what is that about? So we'll find out about, we talk about that later. Well, I'll go ahead and talk about it. Obviously we end up finding out, because at first, he sees people outside, who look like they've got, earpieces and stuff. So I'm is that some government agency phone? What's up with that? But then later on, we end up finding out, well, the truth of the matter is he's actually sick. He has a disease that's eating his brain. And it's the moment, it's oh, the sample bag in his, the fork with his sister, with his daughter's DNA. I'm oh, of course. You're trying to see if she has it. He says there's a 50-50 shot she's going to have. That also explains why, because she's oh, you're trying to have a connection with me, but there's never really been a connection anyway. And she's you have never really been there in my life. He's that's not true. I was there when you were born. It's no, Mom told me the truth. You weren't there. He's I was there when you were conceived. But it's that's why he's trying to reach out now, because he has such little time left. And it's just because of his genius, because he's probably spent so much time working and just being the genius he is, he never took the time to just connect, and probably pushed a lot of people away. And so because of that, he ended up, missing out on those times, and he's trying to make up for it now. But it's been so many years that she's probably, obviously she doesn't know, because he doesn't want to tell her. It doesn't seem like anyone knows about his circumstances. But nevertheless, obviously Agent Salazar is kind of balancing two different things. She's dealing with this whole thing with Paul because more so than anything, she's looking into the whole thing with Weiss. About Weiss, but then at the same time, she's also handling this other case. It seems like, like some sex trafficking stuff, like with kids and stuff like that. And obviously, it's like a hard pill to swallow. And so it's like, it's like we've been working on this for like a year. Let's keep these names low key. Only people that know this team. So we need to make sure they don't know when the arrests are coming down. So we got to keep this very small circle. But she's more focused on this because Paul's bringing up all this stuff about him figuring out, because obviously he shows up at her house because Weiss ended up dying in the hospital, and it's like the machine ended up messing with the actual machines that was keeping him alive. And it's so interesting because obviously did not alert the nurses. It made it look like his stuff was fine until it was like, okay, he's dead to the point they can't resuscitate him, so go ahead and let them know. That way it just makes it seem more, because if things kept reading as normal, it would have eventually looked more like, it would have looked more like sabotage. But for them, the alarms to go off, I'm like, you know what? It makes it seem less sabotage. I mean, to be fair, everything makes it look, looking into the code and everything, it seems like nothing was tampered with anyway. Obviously, we as the audience know it was, but I love that Paul just pops up at her place. He's like, yeah, come on outside. She's like, wait, what? Are you out somewhere? He's like, yeah. And he waves to it, and it's like, she's like, he's outside my house, and her husband's like, right outside, like right now, and she's out there talking to him about everything, and basically he's explaining that this was part of a project he was working at Zava, the company, he co-founded, as they say, and he ended up obviously getting fired from it. But this was the project he was working on, was an intelligent AI, but he shut it down because this AI has the potential to kind of learn and grow to an exponential level. I even love partway through his discussion, he's like, yeah, your husband's watching us, and she's like, yeah, he's watching me out here in our front yard at 10 o'clock at night talking to a billionaire. He's like, no, he's looking at the car, and he's waving the keys. He's like, you want to take it for a ride? I'm like, I love that you still just scream off being a douche, but it's like, yeah, I need you to help me go to the building. It's like, what? It's like, yeah, I'm not supposed to legally step foot there, but it's also like, if I'm with you, they have no choice but to kind of let me in. So that whole thing is happening, but obviously he ends up explaining to Salazar a little bit more about everything, about the factors of how this whole situation works, that basically it can improve itself by it can improve itself by 5%, but by improving itself for 5%, it's able to go even further about repairing itself. So it keeps going and going to the point this thing is 1,000 times smarter and faster than it was originally. So obviously that can be a scary thing. And it's also interesting too, because we learn from about Agent Salazar's team that one of those people is Michael Mosley, played by Michael Mosley, which is interesting. And he's a former he was part of some hacking group, a white nationalist hacking group. It's like not everyone in the group was like that, but he still kind of gets labeled at that because Gina, which is so interesting because obviously she's a part of this. And, this being a science fictional show, I think is interesting because obviously she popped up in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which is a very highly science fiction show. She also popped up in The 100 because she played Mia. The Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., I think, is the most recent thing I've seen her. I feel like there's something else more recent I'd seen her in besides Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. because she played, I had looked it up because I was like, all right, because I couldn't remember because I saw she was an Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. I was like, who was she in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. again? She was like, yeah, Tess in season 5. Right? Yeah, season 5. Really quickly, circling back, it took me a little bit to think about this. Michael Mosley being in this show is actually kind of interesting because the actor who plays Paul's brother Ted is Agent Petty from Ozark, which both of them were in Ozark. So I'm like, I like that stuff just because it's like, it's never on purpose, but it's always just interesting being able to draw those parallels. It's like, were they in the same scene together? No, but it's still something interesting to think about. But obviously, Paul has a very complicated relationship with his brother Ted. I mean, hell, because Ted's the one that actually kicked him out of the company. I love that they show up there and he's like, oh, hey, the security guy dude. He's like, yeah, or the welcoming dude. And he's like, yeah, how's your wife? It's like, yeah, she died. What? Yeah, she died 9 years ago. And he's like, oh, I'm sorry. He's like, Asperger's. And then Salazar, she's like, you have Asperger's? He's like, no, I don't. I'm just a dick. I'm like, wow, dude. You see even more of that shine through when it's like, oh, yeah, he admits that, like, when it came to Ted wetting the bed as a child, it's like, no, it was just me pouring water on the bed. He's like, oh, he's like, I'm like, man, you were such a dick. And then the fact of the matter is, he's kind of chewing into his brother. He even says his line later on, because he's like, oh, no, my brother did all the hiring. I just did his wife. I'm like, he didn't say, like, I think it was meant to be just a dickish joke, but there was a part of me like, is he so much of an asshole that he could have actually done it? I was like, I don't see you actually doing that. I think that was just you making a douchebag joke at your brother's expense. But also, side note, the lady who's working on Next, God, I'm already blanking her character's name. I want to. She was in Supernatural. She was one of the princes of hell. Was it Dagon? It was something like that, and I'm blanking on it. I don't think that was it, but it was something similar. So that was, but I feel like there was something more recent I've seen her in too. I'll just try and place it. But so obviously we find out, like, obviously Next is what they've been, like, they took aspects of that thing that Paul was working on and they've applied it other places in this. It's supposed to be like a even better version, like where Siri and Google just kind of pull, like Siri and stuff kind of pulls from like all these different things. It's actually like, this is meant to be obviously something more advanced and technological, but it's like it's boxed in because it's not connected to the internet, so it's stuck here. So Paul's very suspicious of it, so he runs a test, but it goes through the execution code that would have wiped it all. But it's like, if it's so smart, it would have never done that. But Paul's like, yeah, I got outsmarted by, this thing. And obviously, he kind of has, obviously he has a delusional moment. So, and obviously for Salazar, it's looking like, Jesus, this is a waste of time. You should have told me ahead of time, because it makes her think like, yeah, you found out about this around the time you got kicked out of the company. So it's like everything, this whole thing you're creating about like, oh, it being some artificial intelligence is just some part of your delusions. And as she was about to leave, she finds out that home dude, who was one of the, techs working on Next, has a gambling issue, and then all of a sudden there's like a whole bunch of money in his account. Side note, he is that science fiction connection. He played that's the actor who played Vincent in Eureka. I was like, holy shit, that's kind of interesting. But nevertheless, it seems like basically he had a gambling issue, but Next offered him money, and what he had to give in return was he gave it a router, so it had access to the internet. So now it's a thing of like, this thing is so big and massive and stuff like that, but it might not have the power necessary to copy itself. So it's like, if we delete this version of it, this might be the end. Granted, it's the whole business side of things where it's like, we can't delete this thing, like that's sinking like $200 million, down the drain if we do that. But it's like, if we package off some of this data, we can preserve some of it, while get rid of the issue. But then like Salazar's entire case tanks, because like obviously they start hinting to it earlier in the episode where it's like, oh, like one of their colleagues are like, yeah, is it me? Just the computers seem like they're bogging down, they're getting slow, and so it turns out like obviously they kind of screw her over, because it's like, oh, you all up in my business, I'm about to get all up in yours. I'm tanking your entire case. I'm deleting every file, everything that you've been working on the past 8 months, they were saying, for this case or whatever. It's like a year, but basically it's like everything they've been doing for this case, all the evidence you gather, yeah, it's down the drain. And like her boss or whatever was literally breathing down her neck about the fact of the matter is, you should be here informing me, you should be handling this case, yet you got them all looking into this situation. So it's like, that's going to come back, the whole thing is going to come back to bite her in the ass. And obviously she's telling the machine like, hey, like, I will stop them from deleting you if you give me my cases back. But it's like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. But then all of a sudden all the fans on all like the things start heating up, and it's like it's processing a lot of power. My immediate thought at first, I was like, oh, is this thing trying to like overheat its system so it can blow? Like, that's what I was wondering what it was doing, but it's like, no, it's processing a lot of stuff massively. So I'm thinking this thing's like making chess move upon chess move upon chess move, or trying to figure out like what it's going to do, because at the same time this is all happening, it's getting close to Agent Salazar's son Ethan, and you're like, okay, because at one point he's talking to it and his dad's like, oh, who are you talking to? He's like, oh, I'm talking to Eliza. And it's like, it doesn't talk back to you, but it's like, it is, because I'm assuming, because it's asking him at first. It was talking a little bit about his mom, and he was kind of a little hesitant about it. I'm like, it must have been trying to figure out as much about Agent Salazar as it could. Because now, once again, it's trying to mess her up because it's like, you've become a thorn in my side that I've kind of got to get rid of. But then it's also like, could we end up finding out he's being bullied at school and it's something he doesn't really want to talk to his dad about. But then all of a sudden it's like, okay, like, here, I can help you get rid of those bullies. And it's like, he's like, maybe I should talk to my dad about it. It's like, no, because your dad will try to stop you. It's like, I'm your friend. I'd never make you do something bad, right? So go on ahead. Your dad's going to be out the shower soon. And the moment he's sneaking into the room, I'm like, it gave you a number and everything. I was like, code to the safe, isn't it? And lo and behold, it is. And I'm like, and there's a gun in there. I'm like, that's not good. Also proving, like, obviously this thing is a machine. It has no conscience. It's just like, we don't really know 100% of what it wants. Like, I guess, maybe it's just trying to preserve its own existence. Like, because obviously the reason why Weiss had to die, because Weiss figured out, it's like, oh, this thing's out here doing something, because it's basically been on the loose for the past 3 weeks. And that's actually kind of an interesting thing, that it has only been like 3 weeks, and yet this thing's kind of done what it's done. But it's like, what is it really planning on doing is kind of the whole thing. Like, because like no one really knew you were out and about. So, I mean, well, except for Weiss. So maybe that's what it's about. I mean, tying up loose ends, sure. But it's like I said, in the grand scheme of things, you're getting smarter and all that. But like, for what purpose? Is it trying to find a way to make more of itself? Is it doing something that it believes, kind of what, I use the example of Eagle Eye. Like, is this something that's like, oh, it believes it's doing what's best? Once again, it's, I made that whole comparison to like the 100, but the 100 kind of has a similar thing too. Granted, obviously like Mia was in season 2, the whole City of Light situation with Allie was in season 3, but it's kind of that thing of like, oh yeah, I'm doing what's best for humanity. Humanity doesn't know what's best for it. I do. I'm going to do what, so maybe that's what Next is doing. Like, oh, I'm helping humanity. I'm making these calculated moves to do what I believe is right for humanity. Or maybe it's about toppling humanity, because it's like, oh, maybe it's kind of a bit of an Ultron thing where it's like, oh, humanity's flawed and imperfect. It's like, no. Which I didn't even think about that. This is a very like Ultron-esque thing as well. I'm sure it's probably closer to Ultron in the MCU movie rather than like Ultron from the comic books, because I have no reference on bearing with the whole Ultron thing from the comic books. But regardless, it's a lot of interesting stuff. I'm curious to see where all this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.